In the home of Big Macs, Bon Jovi, and MacGyver, the only thing people love more than those three things is championships. Insert sports reference here. In wrestling, the United States Championship dates back to 1975, and the most wrestler ever, Harley Race, as champion. Now, almost 50 years later, the US title has found its home in many different places and around many different waists, with varying degrees of success. Not a lot of the reigns from WWE represent Land of the Free and Home of the Brave very well, so this list may be a bit more historical than others, but that just means more edutainment for you all. I'm Tempest hailing from partsFUNknown, and these are the 10 greatest United States Championship reigns ever. But before we get on with this list, please make sure that you like this video, subscribe, and enable notifications to always on so you never miss an episode of Fantasy Booking Warfare. You can check out a clip from the latest episode at the end of the video. Number 10, Lance Storm's first reign. Not a lot of things from WCW in the year 2000 wind up on positive lists, but maybe it's just my Canadian bias, but Lance Storm turning the United States Championship into the WCW Canadian Championship is exactly the kind of anti-American propaganda I like to see in my wrestling. Storm held the title from July until Halloween Havoc, with a one-day break in the middle that went unrecognized by WCW at the time, and it probably was the most entertaining character work of Lance Storm's career. Thank you, Johnny Ace, for telling management to leave Storm with him for a couple months so he could develop him, a much better idea than Vince Russo wanting to make Lance Eric Bischoff's son. Moron. Instead, this reign made Lance a top guy in WCW at the time, even if the Canadian Rules match at New Blood Rising is about the most twisted-ass match WCW ever booked, and think of the ground that covers. But at the end of the day, when I think of the US title, this is one of the highlights. Number 9, Tully Blanchard's reign. When the Four Horsemen rode together for the first time, Ric Flair was the world champion, Ole and Arn Anderson were the tag champions, and rounding out the group was United States champion Tully Blanchard. A lot of people think of Tully as the tag guy alongside Arn and the Four Horsemen because of iterations of the group that came later, but the original lineup of the group had Tully as not just the US champion, but one of the best US champions of all time. Having held the belt for the back half of 1985, Blanchard feuded with the holder of the greatest mustache in wrestling history, Magnum TA. This is when Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling was teeming with life, and that clearly extended to their mid-card. Blanchard was a perfect second champion behind Ric Flair, as the Horsemen stood opposite the heroic forces of Crockett Country, holding the title for 4.5 months before dropping the belt to Magnum in the I Quit Steel Cage match that topped our list of the best US title matches last week. Number 8, MVP's first reign. For the most part, US title reigns in WWE have come in two forms: short and uneventful, like Carlito, R-Truth, or Jack Swagger, or long and uneventful, like Antonio Cesaro, Dean Ambrose, or Austin Theory. But thankfully, there are also a few reigns that were equal parts fun and lengthy, namely that of Montel Vontavious Porter. MVP would later add a second reign to his resume, but it was his first reign with the title that made him SmackDown's most valuable pretend basketball player. Setting a new SmackDown record for the time with a 343-day reign that began with MVP beating Chris Benoit, MVP began a frenemy relationship with Matt Hardy that included a tag team title reign, a pizza eating contest, and a boxing match with Evander Holyfield. A holy trinity if ever I've heard of one. MVP took a run at retiring Ric Flair, and then a returning Matt Hardy cost him Money in the Bank en route to the end of this record-setting reign at Backlash. WWE made the ridiculous decision to strap a losing streak gimmick to MVP in the wake of this loss, rather than, elevating him, but while it was happening, MVP as a US champion was a slam dunk. Sports. Number 7, Magnum TA's second reign. Had Magnum TA not been in an awful car wreck in October of 1986, he would most certainly have been an NWA World Champion. As it stands, he remains one of the greatest United States champions in the history of the title, with his second reign standing as his best. This was the reign that started with the aforementioned I Quit Steel Cage match with Tully Blanchard, so you already know there could not have been a better start to this run, which continued with his legendary rivalry with Nikita Koloff that lasted until the end of the summer. Magnum was ultimately stripped of the title for punching NWA President Bob Geigel when Nikita insulted Magnum's mother, but the title was held up in a best-of-7 series between the two men, with Nikita winning the title in the 7th match, which would be the last major thing Magnum would do in the ring. Koloff was another candidate for this list, as his babyface turn following Magnum's accident was one of the more emotionally driven stories of the 80s, but at the heart of all of it was this reign from one of wrestling's greatest what-ifs. Number 6, Greg Valentine's second reign. Second-generation star and second-generation United States champion Greg the Hammer Valentine had already enjoyed one successful reign with the title when he won it from Roddy Piper in 1983 via blood stoppage. '83 was the year of Piper and Valentine, having one of the most famous rivalries in the history of the NWA, culminating in the most famous dog collar match ever at the first ever Starrcade. Piper would ultimately win that non-title match, but it was the quality of those matches and the intensity of that rivalry that made it truly unforgettable, and despite that Starrcade match being non-title, at the heart of this rivalry was the US title. Valentine doesn't quite get the credit he deserves for being such a valuable member of the Mid-Atlantic roster, often trailing world champions like Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, and Ricky Steamboat in conversations regarding the era, but he was an invaluable part of the promotion, as seen with an incredible reign here that is still referenced in modern wrestling. Number 5. Rick Rude's first reign. The same way that names like Mr. Perfect, Bret Hart, and Randy Savage come up as the quintessential Intercontinental Champions of WWE, one of the most quintessential US Champions of WCW was Rick Rude. Maybe it was because of the company he kept, coming in the form of the Dangerous Alliance, one of the great factions of all time with Rude at the helm, or maybe it was because of his 378-day reign, but once he won the title at Clash of the Champions 17, Rude and the title were inseparable, having loads of high-profile feuds along the way. Having won the title from Sting, Rude defended the title against the likes of Ricky Steamboat and Nikita Koloff, and ultimately wouldn't even be beaten for the title, vacating the belt after suffering one of the worst injuries in wrestling history in a match with Sting in Japan. Honest to God, don't look it up if you're squeamish. Rude, as US champion, was big time, and to this day, his reign is still the second longest in the near 50-year history of the belt. Number 4. Roddy Piper's first reign. It was during an era like this, when the second biggest prize in the NWA was being fought over by men like Ric Flair, Ricky Steamboat, and Roddy Piper, that the United States Championship really did feel like the second most coveted championship to be won in the United States. While Piper is known as one of the great heels in the history of the wrestling business thanks to his work in the WWE as well as in Portland, in Mid-Atlantic he fought opposite the villains, defeating Ric Flair to win the US title in January of 1981. This was the biggest win of his career to that point, and while his career was certainly not short on highlights, it still might be the biggest win Piper had. He held the title for 194 days, frequently defending the title against Wahoo McDaniel, the man he would ultimately drop it to, but it was during this time that the title gained even more prominence as its position as the sole US championship in the NWA was solidified when Roy Shire's San Francisco promotion closed its doors, leaving Piper as the undisputed US champion of the National Wrestling Alliance. Number 3. Ric Flair's second reign. There are a great many rivalries that have defined the career of the Nature Boy Ric Flair, but probably none more than his decade-spanning rivalry with Ricky Steamboat. Many people's minds would first go to their classic trilogy of matches over the NWA World Championship in 1989, but less might know that their rivalry started over a decade earlier over the United States Championship. Having already traded the title once, Flair won the title for a second time in a hair versus title match with Mr. Wrestling, Johnny Wrestling's father, I presume, and my god, imagine if that one had gone the other way. And the 253-day reign that followed was his best ever. Flair has said that the US title meant that you were the number 2 guy in wrestling at the time, and given how Flair was perceived in 1979, with many reigns as world champion soon to come, it would be hard to disagree with him. Flair defended the belt against folks like Blackjack Mulligan, Jimmy Snuka, and of course, Ricky Steamboat. Flair and Steamboat's matches were incredibly heated at this time as they traded the title once again. Number 2. Lex Luger's third reign. To this day, the longest title reign in the history of the United States Championship belongs to Lex Luger. Luger is not often regarded as one of wrestling's biggest success stories, mostly due to his failed run in the WWF, but as an up-and-comer in the final years of Crockett Country, he was really looking like a somebody. Luger's third reign with the US title lasted 523 days, from May 1989 to October 1990, when he dropped it to Stan Hansen in a bull rope match at Halloween Havoc. But during that time, he was one of the top stars of the promotion. He fended off all comers through honest and nefarious means, retaining against the likes of Brian Pillman and Ricky Steamboat, while also making a run at Ric Flair and the World Heavyweight Championship as a babyface. Again, the US title being used to properly elevate its holder to world title status. Maybe he would have managed to get there and stay there if WCW wasn't starting to completely go off the rails, but I suppose he will have to settle for the longest and arguably greatest US title reign of all time. And number 1, John Cena's fourth reign. While John Cena's legacy-altering United States Championship from WrestleMania 31 to SummerSlam 2015 was barely a third as long as Luger's, clocking it at only 147 days, it is by far the best in WWE history, and is my choice for the greatest of all time due to the sheer quality and quantity of his title defenses. This was when WWE decided the US title was gonna matter, and to make that happen, they put the title on the biggest star in the company and told him to have the best match on the show nearly every week for 5 months. From a Night After Mania banger with Dean Ambrose, to his trilogy of matches with Kevin Owens, to his Raw main events with Cesaro, and his title versus title match with Seth Rollins at SummerSlam, Cena managed to completely change the way people viewed him with this title reign, finally giving all us know-it-all fans a reason to put some respect on his name and his in-ring game. This was the greatest WWE mid-card title reign in decades, and single-handedly took its place in the history books as the best United States Championship reign of all time. And that's our list. Please make sure that you like this video and check out this clip from the latest episode of Fantasy Booking Warfare.
Is there any point of having a tag match at all then? Why don't you just do the Hardys versus, I don't know, the As Boys?
Yeah.
As Boys.
It's your favourite team,
Boys, your favourite team.
You might as well just do that.
I believe this has come up with me on the desk.
That might be better.
Yes, Tempest. Why is the Hardy Boys retirement match not against the Ass Boys?
I really wanted to make it to the next round.
Yeah.